Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-host, Wilfred Riley. Sitting in with us this week is Christy Kelly, writer, conservative, Humanity Assemble podcast host. Christy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And our guest this week is Rio Veradonir, editor-in-chief of Queer Majority. Rio, welcome to the show.
Hi, guys. Nice to be on.
It's good to have you. Maybe you can help us out and clear some of the madness that we've been hearing a lot in the culture, a lot of the debates up. And we'll get to the Queer Majority in a moment and talk about what you write about, what you do, and what you're trying to accomplish there. But first, I want to start with really simple high-level stuff, like your thoughts on the overall, I guess we call it a cultural debate on the LGBT issue.
My thoughts. Well, yeah, that's a broad question. Yeah, we could call it a culture war. That's what we call it at QM. One thing we're trying to do is to de-radicalize the LGBT movement and depoliticize LGBT issues. I feel like, of course, it's not just LGBT issues that have been taken over by extremists recently. It's also happened with anti-racism and feminism as well. Basically, all human rights issues have been taken over by far-left extremists, which doesn't really benefit anybody but them. And unfortunately, too many self-identified liberal people are willing to pander to a rather anti-liberal neo-Marxist agenda, even though they, as evil bourgeois elites, they'd be the first people against the wall if they got their way. So what I would say is it's important for people to remember that most LGBT people, just like most women and most people of color, are not far-left extremists, and that those people don't really speak for us. So we created QM in part to be a voice of the silent majority, to kind of stand up against the insanity and recognize that a more liberal approach to LGBT rights and women's rights and racial equality had already won since decades ago, I would say. I mean, with same-sex marriage, we kind of like got the last thing we needed, frankly. So yeah, I mean, we already had succeeded. And then these extremists came along and said, no, actually, we need to dismantle marriage and we need to dismantle capitalism. And if you don't do that, you're a homophobe. So yeah, we kind of are trying to push back against some of that.
Well, that last piece was really important. I was going to mention that, so hopefully we'll get back to that, about we had kind of already won on all of the fronts. But I do want to ask one last question before I get to Will and Christy, and that is your thoughts on how we got here. We had won, right? Why did they need to do anything?
The cynical answer is that a lot of people with jobs similar to mine felt the need to justify their existence and their nonprofit's existence or whatever in order to keep the temperature up. And so if you win, what do you do when you've dedicated your life to a cause and you've succeeded? Well, one thing you can do is you can move the goalposts. And if you can cry wolf enough, then you can make people feel like everything's still an emergency and they still need to donate all of their money. So that's the cynical reason. Maybe the kinder reason, which does apply to some people, is that a lot of these folks are genuine. They really believe in these ideas. And they really think that, liberal institutions need to be torn down and democracy is bad and capitalism is bad, and that somehow they're all tied into our human rights. With those folks, we simply need to defeat them or change their minds.
Christy, would you like to go first as the guest?
Yeah, I guess. Well, thank you. I guess one thing that kind of jumps out as you were talking, Rio, and I think one thing in general that a lot of people complain about is that the movement always kind of ties into, Black rights or women's rights. Like, why do you guys do that? Why don't you just talk about your movement in a vacuum instead of kind of bootstrapping it on or in comparison to?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. The reason I brought those issues up was not to say that LGBT rights should be bootstrapped to them. It was to say that they are all being bootstrapped to this critical social justice ideology.
Mhm.
And I agree with you that that's not a good thing. People should be able to advocate for their own rights without appropriating other people.
Will?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all going to ask things about kind of the same stuff, the same, portion of what was said there. I tend to agree with Rio that we saw massive civil rights movements. And obviously the first one of those was the Black Civil Rights Movement, unless you're counting Jewish Americans or something. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. But we saw these from the 30s, 40s through the 60s, and most of them in the terms that were laid out by their founders, by King or Steinem or something, were very successful. Like the U.S. Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. I mean, that recently changed a little bit. We've had pro-minority affirmative action for 55 plus years, and that obviously has had an effect. If you look at the Latino, even more than the Black middle class or something like that, there's just no way to deny that. So, I mean, kind of switching to the specific topic of the LGBT rights movement, like I actually was a canvasser for the Human Rights Campaign in college, like traveled around the country, stumping for gay rights, getting in fights with homophobes of every variety, which is kind of funny. Like the new freedom riding was opposed by Black and white people. But I mean, we won. By the time I was at the end of that experience, I mean, gay rights, Obergefell's, I think 2012 had passed. I mean, that's now 10, 11, 12 years in the rearview mirror. So I think most people would agree that one of the reasons movements don't just go away is that they're very large groups that are associated with the movement. Like the Human Rights Campaign isn't the gay rights movement. Those are two separate entities. The Human Rights Campaign is an $800 million nonprofit, basically, business. So, I mean, now they've moved on to trans rights issues, as opposed to just me talking a question then. But like, so what should these movements do? Like, I mean, when you talk about queer majority, if there's going to be a gay rights movement at all, as opposed to us just having gay countrymen, what would be involved in that? I mean, what's a current LGB issue, I guess? Is it pushing back on some of the extremism, or are there still real problems out there?
Well, I like most good classic liberals, I don't really necessarily expect the government to solve all of my problems, LGBT related or otherwise. So my goal isn't to advocate for policy. It's to integrate LGBT people into our very successful, the freest, most prosperous, peaceful society in the history of the world. I just want to integrate us into that society. And I'm not interested in changing it. And I'm certainly not interested in tearing it down and building a utopia on its ashes.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, especially as utopia has never existed, so yeah, it's probably no place.
Nobody's built it yet.
Yeah. Well, nobody's ever going to build it. It's no place in Latin. It's a joke, and I think a lot of liberals under 25 don't seem to get that. That most of the great books about perfect societies were satires. I liked them too until I grew up and realized that, and it didn't take all that long.
I was going to ask a question, and as usual, we'll just put another plant in my head to kind of connect some dots, because you talked about the liberals under 25. Because Rio was talking about we won, and it made me think of something. I wanted to come back to it because I used to say it pretty often. In that we all, I think, already here agree, but most logical people and the people who will listen to this and watch it understand that there's no perfection. There's no, like Will just said, no one's building utopia. So removing the fringes, because there'll always be some violence, racism, just like there'll always be murder and crime. Not only had we won, Will started with the civil rights movement moving forward. We had got to a point, I think it's somewhere around the early 2000s, where you had that perfect mix of, you had popular rock music and hip hop music, but Black people were listening to rock, and the rock people were making mixes like Anthrax, right? And so everybody, so your typical white guy would know a rap song, your typical Black guy would know a rock song, right? It wasn't like these silos that no one knew about. And people had, the neighborhoods became more integrated and schools became more integrated. And then even to the LGBT thing, you went from, and you know, I never met Rio, but I can look at him and assume he's old enough to remember. So we went from not having rights to having rights on paper, but being open gay bash. That was the thing, you know, when I was young, that people would just go around and, you know, attack people for being gay. That went away, but it was still kind of taboo. To gay shows, you know, with major actors who are gay, or their roles were from Will and Grace on, all over TV, music awards and everyone, and no one cared, right? No one cared. That was the sweet spot. And someone came along and said, we just turn this dial a little bit further, we can fix it and make it perfect, because it's not perfect. And the reason I tied to what Will said is because he made a comment about liberals under 25. Well, they weren't alive, or they were too young when that happened. So if you're 40, you remember having it somewhat good, and then that you remember the sweet spot I'm talking about. But if you're young, you don't remember the gay bashing, and you don't remember how far you came from it. So all you know is bad words and safe spaces. So I don't know if that's part of the reason why you're going back. I think the cynical reason is probably better, but is part of the problem beyond what these nonprofits can do and what the government can do, just that people think they have this hubris that they think they can fix everything, and they don't have a clear understanding of how good they have it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, we're transitioning into an information economy, and it's causing a lot of kind of a resurgence of illiberal economic ideas like communism, and illiberal governance structures like fascism. The number of younger millennials and Gen Z who are turning on democracy, not just capitalism, but democracy itself, is also alarming. And I think it's for the same reason you just said. They don't remember the gay bashing. They also don't remember the Soviet Union, or I mean, I don't remember Nazi Germany, but my grandfather was a fighter pilot in World War II, and I grew up knowing him, right? So I think people need to learn from history, and part of the problem is our education system. It's so trendy in academia to trash the West and trash classical liberalism and the philosophy at the foundation of the West that made us as great as we are. We need to have a more balanced education system that teaches people about how much worse things could be and how good we have it. Frankly, it doesn't have to be propaganda the other way, but let's put things in perspective.
What is do you remember, just asking because you might know, you have the clear majority of the, Will was talking about these nonprofits who, and you mentioned it too, that they're doing it because they need to stay open. There was one, I always reference it, but I can't remember the name, that their organization was there to get gay rights. It passed. The next day they put up a banner and say, yay, we won, and they just closed the doors.
Good for them.
Who was it?
Yeah, but you notice that no one remembers the name. That's why people don't do that. Like, I thought of that as someone who used to be an activist.
Will was like, those idiots. Look at all the money
I'm not actually
No.
like, now that I'm out of business, I'm not much of a money grubbing guy, but no, I mean, like, people that are really committed to those sort of things in the sense of like the organization, and yet the money too for the HRC people I know and so on. I mean, yeah, if your organization just shuts down, that it's a wrap. Like, you guys are all managing stores and coaching youth football. You just have ordinary middle-class jobs. And that's the last thing the majority of activists I've met in my life would want to do. Like, the NAACP comes to mind here too, no offense to some of our viewers, but like, it's a pretty sweet life being like the #3 man on the Essence Awards, setting up locations each year and all that. I mean, are you going to say blacks and whites get along pretty well and leave and be an assistant principal somewhere? You know, some people will, and we don't know their names either. They're out there actually doing good. Shout out to King Randall, used to be in the activist space running a school right now. But I mean, there aren't that many of those people that are going to leave a 6-figure job and go out and do that, frankly.
Right. I wish we would. I could attribute that to someone, because I can't remember what the organization was. But more people should do it. But I can see why they wouldn't. And then one more thing. Oh, you were going to say something, Rio? Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I agree that people should be willing to declare victory and maybe move on to another cause that still has more work to be done. But you know, in terms of legal rights, what we really wanted was equal treatment under the law. And one of the problems with the new trendy critical social justice ideology is that it actually violates that very basic principle. of equal treatment. It says, no, we want special treatment. We want to be given a leg up by virtue of our identity or whatever. And also, we need to redistribute cultural capital by privilege checking evil cis white straight men, etc. That is deeply toxic. It's not actually social justice. It's antisocial. So I think more people need to step down. If people can think and reflect and say, am I part of the solution or part of the problem? That approach is a problem that makes those organizations part of the problem. And it's leading to a backlash against LGBT rights. There used to be over 70% support for same-sex marriage in the United States. Now it's down to 64%. We are just about to put out a piece about that. And it's an understandable backlash, because if regular people are quiet and we let the extremists speak for us, and even if as moderate a Democratic president as Joe Biden is willing to pander to the most extreme faction in his party, that is inevitably going to backfire and going to lead to regress and possibly to some people losing hard-fought rights. So, yeah, I mean, it's not just a matter of being willing to step down. It's also, at least don't make things worse.
Right. And we talk about
Charles, I had a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I know from watching, like, you guys barely let Shamika talk, so I know I gotta like raise my hand and say I have a question. But
Who's
anyway,
Shamika? I'm sorry.
Okay. I think a lot of the backlash is everything you've said is great. But I think a lot of the backlash is based on kind of like a study that I saw. A CDC published that 1 in 4 high school kids now identify as some form, of LGBT. And then also, as I was reading your mission statement, I think the queer majority, because I want to ask the question before I get into what I think. You believe, or your mission statement believes, that most people are queer. So if you correlate that with, I'm a mom, what moms are seeing or what parents are seeing in school, I think that is, the undercurrent of a lot of the backlash. So again, I'm asking the question, what do you think? And then I think I'll give my opinion after.
Well, it depends on what you mean by the word queer. I want to answer that quickly to get it out of the way and then come back to the meat of your question. Sure. But basically, when we're using queer there, and it explains it in the about page that you were looking at, that what we mean by that is that most people differ from perceived norms, real or perceived norms around sex and relationships in one way or another. It doesn't mean that we're saying the majority of the population are LGBT. However, as far as the share of the young people who are identifying as LGBT specifically, there have been a lot of polls done about that, and we've written a number of pieces about it that I think you'd find really interesting. And quite intuitively, if you reflect upon it, what that is it's not a bunch of people coming out as trans. It's not even necessarily that many more people coming out as gay. It's a lot of young people coming out as bisexual, because what they actually are in many cases is what we might call heteroflexible. They're predominantly attracted to the opposite sex, but because of society becoming more accepting of same-sex relationships, there's less of a stigma on it. And so anybody who feels even a little bit of attraction to people of the same sex can say, honestly, that they are bisexual. And you can put them on the Kinsey scale and call them a 0.5 if you want. So I think that's what a lot of that is. It's just people saying, hey, I'm open-minded. I'd consider maybe dating a guy, but I'm probably going to take a girl to the prom anyway.
Yeah, no, that's in line of what I think and of what's been my reality. So I spent the majority of my life in California. I have 3 daughters. One's an adult, 2 are teenagers. So California, of course, is very liberal. I know the first time my daughter came home and was like, hey, Molly, fake name, has 2 moms, I started freaking out because she was in kindergarten. And I'm like, how am I going to explain this? But I didn't have to, because kids in kindergarten don't really understand. They don't care about sexuality. They didn't care about the two moms. So I never had to really explain it. We left there when, they were still pretty young, and we went to Mississippi. So I'm like, okay, we're escaping a lot of this, what conservative parents would call craziness, hysteria, trying to kind of, indoctrinate our kids, right? We go to Mississippi, middle of nowhere. And at that time, we started homeschooling because I wasn't going to take them from California school district to Mississippi. So I started homeschooling. I started teaching at their co-op. I would say out of the 10 kids in the co-op, I kid you not, 8 of them either were identifying as gay or bisexual. It blew my mind because we think it is LA, the cities, and it's not just that. It's everywhere. It's in rural America. Kids just hide it more because they know their parents are Bible Belt, right? And not really gonna go for it. So they just hide it more. So this is in line with what you're saying as far as, okay, most people identify as queer. I think parents' problem with it and my problem with teens is when they're, 12, 13, and they have a best friend that's Molly, and they feel comfortable with Molly. They like Molly. They don't even know at that point what sexuality is. They just know that they like Molly. But because everything now is thrown into their face, they have TikTok, they have the music saying, hey, 2 girls bring to, everything around them is telling them that, it's okay to be bisexual. This is the thing to do. All of their popular stars, are, kissing girls, kissing other girls. So their minds are, I think, not legitimately, it's not like I legitimately like a girl, a same-sex partner, but combined with what social media is telling them, it lends itself more to that. So I think that's where parents are having an issue with the LGBT agenda being pushed onto our kids at such a young age when kids shouldn't even be identifying their sexuality yet.
So is the issue that people should be identifying for themselves, and the argument from the people pushing this is that stop pushing your, cisgender normative stuff on it. Let these kids choose what they want to do, which is fine. But then they don't let them choose because society is really choosing for them by, leading them, suggesting, putting that helping hand in there to kind of push them in a direction.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's say I agree with you in the sense that I think that a lot of the backlash was inevitable. And I think that most parents are just trying to do what's best for their kids. In trying to avoid the backlash, one thing we need to do is we need to change the way we go about educating children. It needs to be age appropriate. And what's appropriate for a 16-year-old is not the same as what's appropriate for a 12-year-old. It's not the same as what's appropriate for an 8-year-old. It's a spectrum. And parents aren't going to agree about what is and isn't appropriate all the time. They're not always going to draw the line in the same place. But in general, most of us would agree that it's a spectrum and that it's appropriate to draw the line and say, no, not this. I'm not going to show my 14-year-old this movie. I'm not going to teach my 14-year-old out of this book. That's an important conversation that we should be having as a democracy. And LGBT activists who aren't willing to compromise and listen to people's very genuine concerns, but instead are pushing the most extreme version of their ideology possible on everybody else, aren't doing anybody favors, least of all LGBT people, because that is going to cause a backlash, and for good reason.
One quick comment here in terms of something that Christy said that I thought was really interesting. Like when you said in a class of 10 kids in Mississippi, 8 of them were bi. I mean, one of the things that I find when I look at some of the data on this for actual social science research is that a lot of this is kind of questionable. And I mean, I'm not going to get into like the technical breakdown of anyone's sexuality, especially we're talking about young people. But I saw a chart the other day for something like the 4th time that looked at female, urban, white and black bisexuals in their 20s and found that only like 30% of them, I believe, had ever had sex with a woman. So the figures vary a little bit, but that, in fact, in my own experience as a college man and so on, that sounds about right. So, I mean, I guess one question that comes up, in addition to parental backlash, is the question of how, as a gay or bi man or just as a citizen, you would deal with the expansion, let's say politely, of the LGBT community. So, I mean, when you see, I wrote a piece about this for National Reviewer. They actually commissioned me to like look at this data and talk to people and so on. But I mean, when you see a figure like 24% of people say they are LGBT, to someone in my generation, that kind of sounds like they're gay. And it sounds almost like an existential issue. Like, I love my gay brothers, but what are we going to do if a quarter of the country's gay? We've got a pretty low birth rate here. But that's not what it means. It means that people are bisexual in the sense that they might have a threesome occasionally, or they identify as NB because they're business women and they don't feel they meet the social norms for. So I guess what is the queer community? I mean, as Christie's question about even how you frame that on your website, when you're advancing gay rights issues, I mean, that's pretty understandable. But if you're talking about a set of issues for bisexual urban women and people who identify as non-binary and people who are transgender and so on, is there a coherence there? Do you see all of these people as queer? Are they all unified?
The simple answer to that question is the reason for using the broadest possible definition of the word queer is actually to intentionally welcome straight people as readers, as contributors to the magazine, in order to push back against the idea that there are these separate communities. There's straight people and then there's LGBT people. That is not a liberal way of thinking, right? What we want to do, if we want to integrate into society, is we want to highlight the ways in which straight people also benefit from sexual and romantic liberty, right? Laws against sodomy also apply to a lot of straight couples out there, right?
I think a lot of men and especially women on the right don't really know what some of this would involve. This is my last interjection, but yes, a classical sodomy law, having trained as a lawyer, in fact, not briefly, went through the whole process, did fairly well. But a classical sodomy law would ban all anal sex. It would ban bluntly men going down on women. That was often considered submissive and unnatural. Like, that's what that would be. I mean, so yeah, the argument when, people are bantering about this online with the Roman statues and Pepe images on the profiles on Twitter and Facebook, I'm not sure people know what that would mean. Just a note there.
Yeah, exactly. Oral and anal sex are things that straight people enjoy. There are lots of polyamorous people who are not LGBT. In fact, LGBT people actually have more rights than polyamorous people do, because same-sex marriage is legal, but polyamorous marriage is not. So there's all kinds of conversations to be had, and I'm not really here to take a position on a bunch of specific policy issues, but the point is, whether you're discussing ways for government to get out of our way and for all of us to be more free as individuals, or if you're just discussing ways that we can tweak social attitudes so that people are more accepting of the fact that we're not all the same. The way to go about it isn't to say, oh, look at me, I'm a poor oppressed minority, give me, give me, give me. It's to say, I'm a human being, you're a human being. We both benefit from living in a pluralistic society that recognizes our rights as individuals to pursue happiness in our own way. And isn't that a beautiful thing?
Can I ask you a question? We mentioned it a couple times, and you talked about at the end there, talking about having more rights than polyamorous people because their relationship is not legal. So what are LGBT rights?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Because
I keep hearing you don't have any.
No, well, okay. So when I think the Supreme Court was right in Obergefell in the sense that we really should codify it in law, though. But in the sense that if you have an institution called marriage, which is such an important fundamental thing in so many people's lives, and is very good for society, and we should be encouraging, then it's wrong to exclude certain people from being able to participate in that. And therefore, same-sex marriage is a right. If heterosexual marriage is a right, then so is same-sex marriage. That's what I mean by rights. I mean it in the traditional liberal sense, not.
Well, I didn't really mean you, though. I just meant in general in them, because I mean,
well,
okay, so
yeah,
so two things, because I would say outside of that one, what are the other rights you don't have? But even in that, in your definition, it brings up a problem in that if you're saying that marriage is a right, and so if heterosexual people can get married, then same-sex people should be able to marry. That lends it to the thing, which was a crazy right-wing thing before. And when I used to hear it, I'd be like, what are these people talking about? That I always channel my Rick Santorum. I said, Rick Santorum was crazy. But in this sense, you can't say he's crazy because we're making that argument then, right? So you mentioned the polyamorous people not having the rights. Why? That's the constitutional right then. And they should have a right to marry too.
Yes and no. I mean, I'll just say personally, I'm polyamorous. I'm married to a woman. She's also bisexual. We both date other people. We actually just signed a co-parenting agreement with a fancy San Francisco lawyer who specializes in non-traditional families.
Right.
That says that any kid that we have will all be parents. That's how same-sex couples used to get married before it became legal, was they would just pay a bunch of money to a lawyer, get a bunch of documents drawn up, variety of them. We're creating a trust for the family so that we can share assets and so forth, those sorts of things. Look, I'm not saying that I'm a deeply oppressed person because their government doesn't recognize my ability to marry more than one person. Oh, I know you're not saying that. Some people would say that, right?
Right.
I just brought it up as an example of a way that a lot of straight polyamorous people also benefit from a more liberal attitude toward sex and relationships. And I want to be really clear. When I say liberal, I mean in the traditional classical sense, not in the sense that's being taken over to mean basically slow socialism.
Right. I just think that there's still some, it's unclear what people in general, okay, not you, what the radicals mean by rights. Because they talk about rights, and even then, before they got into the crazy stuff, when you say we need to focus on gay rights, you say, okay, what rights don't you have? That's the only thing that normal people would say is the marriage. And I remember that, and I was on the side of same-sex couples. However, as a Christian, I still think I was like Ike Turner. I was like, that's my daddy name. I want my name. So what I would say is same-sex couples should not be able to get married. However, I was for national civil unions, so they had the same legal protection. And so when my Christian friends would say, no, it's, they shouldn't be able to do it. It's okay with different states' rights kind of deal. And I give them the Chicago to Indiana Sugarland story. So Sugarland had a concert in Indiana. Illinois had same-sex civil unions. Indiana did not. A couple from Illinois went to the concert, stage collapsed on one of them. And because it happened in Indiana, they had no rights in Indiana. That's crazy, regardless of what your beliefs are. There's a way to fix that legally but once you change the definition of marriage, there's no end to changing the definition of marriage. That was my issue. So there is no logical reason, once you've opened up that gate, why you should not be, like you say, your relationship should have the same weight as a same-sex or a heterosexual couple at that point.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm happy to have this conversation. I really only brought it up as an example, but the main thing I would say is, obviously, you have a right to your beliefs and you have a right to express them. And I don't take what you're saying personally. I know that it's not coming from a place of bigotry or animus toward me as an individual. And I don't think that you should endlessly expand the concept of marriage until people are marrying their dogs or their favorite car or whatever. I do think we have to have limits. So what I would want to do then is, if we had more time, I would step back and have a longer conversation about things that we have in common, like the fact that we both believe that marriage is good for society and it's a good model for raising children. And there are all kinds of studies that show whether it's a same-sex couple or an opposite-sex couple, that children do better in homes where.
How are they going to have a child, though?
Oh, what? What do you mean by that?
You mean a gay couple? I mean, just with a different sex friend, sperm donation. I mean, like quite a few.
So they're not having a child. That's somebody else having a child. They're not having a child.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, like that depends.
You're not sure whether they can have a child?
No, I mean, it depends what you mean by having a child. Like it would be pretty easy.
Couple have a child.
Well, you're not going to have a child that's half one woman and half the other. But I mean, that's like saying, how can an infertile person have a right to a child? Well, you'd adopt a child. And it's very similar. There's a substantial legal structure there. You could easily, for example, in the same-sex case, just get pregnant using the old turkey baster of legend with the help of a mutual friend of the couple. Then you'd have a child that was 50% composed of the DNA of one member of the couple, and would, under standard U.S. law, as far as I remember, family law, have most.
Okay.
Well, I mean, so that it would be very easy to have a kid. What do you
It
mean?
would not be easy. It's not okay. Fine. Okay.
Well, you're saying you can't. I mean, obviously, like, you can't biologically, as a woman, have sex with another woman and get her pregnant. But in terms of like the recognition of adoption as, you know, the source of legal children,
but adoption
in a
is
family.
separate. That's again changing. That's changing the topic to adoption. Adoption is a separate thing. Adoption is adoption.
But what do you mean? Like, if you adopt a child, is that not legally your child?
But you didn't. No, it's not legally your child.
Well, of course it is. If you have an adopted kid, it's legally your
Why
kid.
would you ask me if it was legally my child? Then
No, but
that's a weird question.
I'm kind of confused by this whole line of conversation. Like, so obviously, if you are a member of a lesbian couple and both of you agree to have sex or whatever your technique is, stem cells can do amazing things these days. Actually, a mouse was just born that had two dads. But if you use some complex petri dish method and you have a child that is the biological child of one or both of you, I don't see why that wouldn't be a child. But even if you don't, even if you just adopt a kid, that's still your kid. Anyway, this isn't an issue I care much about at all, but like, to take away the parental rights of everyone who's an adoptive parent would be a hell of a move. I mean, that's
and along the same lines, adoption is also something that's good for society, particularly
Basically,
if you're pro-life. Adoption is a very important thing. That there are lots of children out there who need caring parents.
I think we're changing the topic of conversation. So, Christy, you have a question you want to ask?
I had a comment and then I do have a question. Because I want to go back. We got into the crazy weed argument, so I'm going to take us back.
We'll spend 20 minutes on adoption.
Will was saying that he was skeptical of the statistic that 1 in 4 high school kids are queer. And I think you said, well, they haven't had the sexual experience. Having the actual sexual experience is not what the metric is. So when they go in and they say, you know, is the kid queer? I mean, again, kids will often identify as, you know, queer, and they've never had an experience with a same-sex partner. They just know that there's some attraction to it. So definitely. And then also, if you think of, you know, take back, you know, my small homeschool group, all of those kids are friends. So it's almost like, hey, I like red sneakers. Oh, I want some red sneakers too. You know, I think that's a lot of what was going on, you know, is them talking and them saying, oh, yeah, I think I am too. And I think that's when people say it almost becomes trendy, or it almost becomes kind of the thing to do, is what you see in a lot of high schools. Again, going back to social media and going back to what the rap songs are saying, you know, I got 2 girls, you know, how popular is that? A guy having 2 girls, right? And then the girls buying into, this is what men want. They want us to be bisexual, and the kids are eating this up. So I don't argue with you that the statistics are skewed, but it's how you interpret them. And again, it's the CDC. So like most people, right? Like, I'm not saying that 8 of these kids were actively having sex with the same sex, but they were identifying as at least bi-curious, right? Which, as a mom, that's still, and one more thing, I have 3 girls. So for me, I feel like it's almost a miracle if one of them doesn't end up gay, right? You know, I almost feel like Chris Rock, like that thing Chris Rock was like, my number 1 goal is to keep my daughter off the pole. Right now, me and my husband, we've had this talk. Of course, if one of our daughters came out as gay and that is what she really felt like she was, of course we would love her. And of course we would support her. But as a mom, I want to make sure they're not doing it because society is influencing them to do it. And I think I'm not part of Moms for, you know, is it Moms for Liberty? I'm not part of any of these groups, but I think that's what they would honestly say. If our child came to us and said, you know, hey, I'm legitimately gay. Okay, is it because you honestly feel this, or is it because of societal pressures? I did have one question. Why is cis a thing? Why is cis even a thing? Now, I'll tell you, when I grew up, you know, very conservative household. So when I got into my, I think 20s, maybe late 30s, that's when I found Sex in the City. And even, me being in my 20s and 30s, I was like, wow, women are out here, like they're that liberated. And I was like, oh, Samantha, like, and I'm a grown woman and I was kind of in awe and I liked it, right? I was much more liberal then. I saw the Sex and the City that came out. Did you guys see it?
I heard about
Okay.
it.
I
Miranda,
actually did with a female partner, and yeah, it's kind of pathetic. Just I'm not in the demo for the show. Like I'm probably as not in the demo for the show as you can be, but it was well done of its kind. Like the New York or Chicago women sitting around talking about guys and sex and so on. This added a lot of kind of modern woke stuff that made it very,
oh my
yeah,
goodness.
unwatchable.
Miranda left Steve for and I don't want to get canceled. So Rio, it's a they them, right?
Oh, like
Well, it's just a woman or a man,
non-binary person. Yeah, but yeah, she left
Right.
her for another female.
Who
Yes.
didn't but she didn't go by either gender. I don't know the correct term. I'm sorry.
Non-binary is
non-binary.
Non-binary.
preferred.
Yeah, non-binary. Like it blew my mind. So again, sorry. Why is cis a thing? Because I had to look it up when I saw it on Sex and the City. I didn't know what it was.
There are so many things I want to address about all that. Regarding the percentages of the population who are LGBT, which is not the same thing as queer, the way we use it at queer majority. I would definitely be somewhat skeptical of very high numbers in general. But insofar as there seems to be a trend toward a rather surprisingly number of people coming out as LGBT, it definitely is that bi number. And people who are mostly straight and have like a little curiosity about attraction to the same sex qualify as bisexual according to the scientific definition of the term, whether they act on it or not. And so on the one hand, we don't really know how many of those people really are bi. But on the other hand, I also am sympathetic to your point that it's perfectly reasonable, especially if you're dealing with a minor, for a parent to say to their kid, hey, okay, let's have a conversation about this. Is this just because your friends are doing it, et cetera? I think that's a reasonable thing for parents to say. A lot of hardcore activists would say that that was homophobic or whatever, but I don't think so, as long as the motive is the one you said and not because you actually are homophobic. I mean, it sounds rather trite, but unless you're homophobic, you're not homophobic. People need to stop calling people that unless they actually are. As far as why cis is a thing, it's kind of like the word straight, right? Once you had a term for colloquialism for homosexuals, gay, you kind of needed a colloquialism for heterosexuals, straight. That's insofar as cis isn't being abused as a way of attacking people for not being trans, which is an absurd thing to attack somebody for. I don't personally have a problem with it. I see it as just a way of saying somebody who is not transsexual, and therefore they're cis. I think that's fine, but I understand why a lot of feminists are annoyed by it, because it's being used by an ideology that plays the oppression Olympics to say, oh, I'm more oppressed than you are as a trans woman. I'm more oppressed than you as a cis woman. And what the appropriate way to handle the oppression Olympics is to say, we're not going to play that game. It doesn't matter who is more or less oppressed. What matters is we're all individuals and we all deserve to be treated equally under the law. End of.
Chrissy, you said that you have 3 daughters, and if you sat them down and they said they were gay, you'd be okay with that. Lesbian, actually. What if they ended up on the pole? You never told us what would happen if they ended up on the pole, which is worse.
Oh.
You don't have to answer that. You mentioned it. You mentioned the Chris Rock thing, but Rio, you mentioned earlier, obviously, that there's going to be pushback against this, because I was going to say, like I always say, we're creating more homophobes by the way we approach what we consider to be gay rights. But we hear a lot. Everything is political now. We hear it on all the political terms, and if you're talking LGBT, the same thing. You hear a lot of this, and I understand why, because because you hear so much nonsense from the extremes on both political sides that people have to push back against it. So a lot of times when you talk about this, people have to have this clarifying comment where they're saying, well, they do this on the left and they do this on the right too, or vice versa. And they say, well, yeah, they might be this extreme approach to this, but it's both sides. But I could be wrong, but I don't look at this as it's always definitely both sides, but is it at the same level? Is it manifesting itself in the same way? And I guess part of it, the reason I think it seems different here is because a lot of what you see, I guess for this conversation, I'll call it the right, but a lot of what you see that may not be, that may be taking place on the right that's inappropriate is in response to the madness that's happening. So it's almost like well, that's not really, it's a difference also because one is more reactionary and defensive where the other thing is being pushed. So, it kind of makes it seem when you see a lot of stuff in social media and in articles talking about, there's a rise of this right-wing approach of XYZ. It's like, no, we just said in 2000, there were right-wingers and Christian conservatives then. Right.
Yes.
The difference is what you're doing, what you're putting in the schools and what you're putting out there and what you're putting in the military and what the government is sanctioning is forcing people to feel that they're overreacting the way they speak up. So do you agree with that? Or do you really think there is an equal size and push of this stuff that the left is doing on the right?
Regarding the equal size, what I would say is I actually think on both left and right, the actual extremists are a pretty small group of people. It's helpful for me to think of it as basically 5 groups of people, if you would. So you've got the people, if you're going from like left to right, you've got the people on the far left who really believe in the insane woke stuff. They're a tiny percentage of the population. Most polls seem to suggest there's something about 6%. It's really that small. However, they are extremely influential in academia and in journalism, and in
the Biden White House. But go on.
Partisan politics, and partisanship is a huge problem, and it always has been.
Right.
And then there's this much larger group of people who are just normal liberals who should know better than to pander to an anti-liberal far left agenda, but they don't. And so they go along with it, maybe because they think it's more important to get that 6% on their side so that they can stand up against the evil people on the right that they're convinced are all horrible people. That's a mistake. Most people on the right are not horrible people. Then there's this third group in the middle, which is where I put myself. And these are people who are just saying, like, I'm not going to pander to the crazies on either side, frankly. And actually, that group really kind of goes from center left to center right. And most of us have some beliefs that you could put into both of those categories. That's fine. That's part of living in a democracy, and that's a wonderful thing. And then, on the other side, you've just got the right-wing version of the opposite of what I said on the other side, right? So now you've got this tiny percentage of extremists. These are the people who actually identify unironically as Nazis or whatever. They're horrible people. Then you have this larger group of people who they'll kind of gaslight you and say, oh, there aren't any really actual Nazis out there. That's not a real thing. You're just, just like these people do. What wokeness? That's not real. That's not a real thing, right? Now, I don't find those two groups of people very helpful. I think that we all need to move into the middle in that sense and be willing to. Both parties just need to kick the crazies out. That's what my 2 cents is about that.
Are those on the right 6%?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the extreme right, but if you, in terms of being analogous to the woke left, in terms of people who are as against the basic tenets of our society as the woke left are, I'd say it's a very small percentage of the right. I don't think that it's.
You think it's larger than the extreme left, or about the same size?
It's probably about the same size.
Yeah, there's actually just as a quick comment, there's a paper that Rio's probably citing that looks at this and puts people in different categories. Like most people are in, it was something like the tired ass majority or the miserable majority. They used more polite language, but most people are just citizens. They want to go out, open the store, and that was 40%. Then you have like your fairly committed liberals, more common on the coast, and that was 21% or something like that. The actual dissident right, like the people that spell the word return with a V in it, that want to go back to a far prior era in the USA. Like a good way to test this when I do research is actually to ask people if they want an ethno state.
Mhm.
Like for whites, even for the Hotep brothers, like, would you really prefer to live in a country with no Irish bars and Szechuan food and Thomas Sowell? And like when you phrase it that way, it literally is. It's like 7% over on the dissident right. Rio already broke down who the people on the left are.
That is
I will say one
shocking.
thing is, businessman on the right, the people on the left that are crazy are a lot more influential than the people on the right
That's what I
that
was
are
going to
crazy.
say, because where are they? I've never met those people on the right, but I see the ones on the left all the time.
Well, I mean, if in all honesty, like, we're all pretty well liked on the American right, but like, if you just like Elijah Schaffer, who's a funny guy, I don't think he's a Nazi, but like consistently has been doing these polls on Twitter to
No,
like
but I
see.
mean, like walking down the street, like in
Well,
the school. I mean, in person, I meet the people on the left, and I don't see the people on the right.
well,
Are they
no, but
ashamed?
that's kind of my point. Like the people on the left have this institutional power.
Yes.
So like when someone says something like Scott Adams is someone we talked about bringing on the show. Like if someone
Right.
says get away from black people, they get fired, lose their job. If someone says get away from white people, they get a book contract. Like Robin DiAngelo, Ibram Kendi, that's the difference. I'm not making jokes.
Right, no,
Like
you're right.
Professor Crump works at like Boston University.
Yeah.
But I mean, like in all reality, though, like there are polls on social media with real people answering them that are things like, would you ever date a single mom? What if she dated a black guy once? And you see again, 7-8% of men are like, nope, that's over the line. Like it's pretty easy to measure this. So like you do have those polls on both sides. It's just the extreme right is marginalized. The extreme left is in Congress if you look at the squad. So bit of a difference.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that those of us who are in that middle group, who are not trying to pander to either group, need to normalize is the idea that being a communist is no more acceptable than being a fascist, right? Because a lot of people really feel deep down that, well, at least the communists have good intentions, right? Well, I mean, like a lot of fascists also have good intentions. And if you talk to people who really believe in it, they will try to justify it in ways that sound very similar to how communists justify it. In fact, they're so similar that it's hard to tell them apart sometimes, frankly. So yeah, I think people should be ashamed to identify as a communist. I think that's something that we need to bring back. It's not fashionable. It shouldn't get you a book deal. They were always in academia. They were always in academia. If you go back far enough, there were also fascists in academia. Some things are stigmatized for a reason.
And then in Queer Majority, you write a lot about sex and freedom of sexuality and things of that nature. So, Will, we talked about this with a couple of guests when they come up, but why do you think, because you write about it a lot, so maybe you have another opinion on it. Why isn't sexual freedom and the changes in sexuality and normative behavior being allowed not leading to more sex? Why do you think that people are having less sex?
He did just write about that for us, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I want your opinion. Will's on here all the time.
Oh, you're asking me. Oh, I thought you were asking
I
Will.
can tell you.
No, I want to ask
an in-demand guest,
here every week. I know what Will would say.
What would I say?
Actually, wait, what would Will say? I want to hear that.
I don't want the recall. He said it on the episode. I go play it.
Okay. The way I would prefer to frame this is there is, both on the left and the right, there is often a tendency toward a kind of status paternalism where people say, oh, we can't give people too much freedom because they might make decisions that are bad for them, right? And what I would prefer to say is, with freedom comes responsibility, right?
Uh-oh.
So maybe some people will choose to do things that I don't personally approve of, but as long as they're not hurting me or somebody else, it's not really my business. As far as why they're not having sex, And if that is a side effect of sexual freedom, then that's something that a paternalist might bring up. I don't know. I think actually it's not sexual freedom that's causing it. I would say it's probably like COVID, the internet. People are spending way too much time watching TikTok and not enough time going to the bar with their buddies and hitting on girls. That's probably why. And there is an ideologically driven backlash against the sexual revolution, which Wilfred brilliantly wrote about, and I'd prefer to let him speak about. But if he's already said it on the show, then I will make him repeat it.
No, we
Well, I mean, you can break down the article I wrote for Queer Majority, which you can find by Googling Wilfred Riley Queer Majority, or but like really there were two explanations for declining sex when we looked at the data. The first and by far the most significant was what Rio pretty much just said, which is that people spend less time together. Like when you think about the amount of not really quality time, but just blunt quantity time you used to spend with your family and your friends, like prior to like junior year of high school, like you and your buddies would be riding around on bikes looking for like pickup basketball games. You'd go fishing. There'd be girls around. You'd learn how to kiss each other awkwardly. Like that doesn't really happen to the same extent. That is true for adults as well. There are whole books like Bowling Alone about the decline of military participation, varsity athletic participation, local political participation, the gym, the church. By the way, if you want to know where to meet normal men or women, those are like 5-6 places that were just listed. Yeah. So people are no longer in them, and that affects sex. And yeah, the other thing is that for a lot of I don't like some of the beating these guys take, but like the incel portion of the right and for the radical feminist portion of the left, I mean, a lot of these people are so mad at some of the things the sexual revolution did, like some of the real issues like OnlyFans, porn culture, that they're almost, which by the way, I think is really overhyped as a threat, by the way, like porn is not making people commit rapes and all, it's completely made up. But I mean, many people are backlashing to sex itself. So that's a smaller factor, but that affects maybe 15% of men and women. So two things. People need to spend more time together in reality. That also, by the way, is a solution to a lot of our racial problems, solution to a lot of our political problems. I'm not going to get in a rant here, but it just really is. The more people you know that are black, Republican, white, gay, whatever, the more normal you're likely to think they are.
And Twitter isn't the public square. It's a privately owned company, right? Where people, many of them anonymous, can go on and say all sorts of things that they would never say to another human being in the public square. So I think that a lot of our social ills right now are caused by social media, but that doesn't mean we should outlaw social media, of course. It doesn't mean the government needs to regulate it. What I do think it means is maybe companies should look at alternative ways of making money. Like maybe it shouldn't all be based on advertising. Maybe do a subscription model instead. That's the reason why programs that I watch on Netflix are so much better than the content that I get on TikTok. Right?
So, quick comment. I am shocked that sex is on the decline because when I left the dating scene, now I've been married for a number of years now again, but that's when it was like Tinder and Plenty of Fish, and it was definitely like the hookup era. And so it seemed like everybody was having like a lot of casual sex. So I'm going to have to look at that article, Will, because I'm shocked. Like it seemed like it was at the height of casual sex. And then my second comment is you mentioned, Rio, about cis being and the feminists being mad at that term. I am not a feminist. And I'm as far away as you can get from that as possible. And I know, we don't like the term as well. Conservatives, don't use the term. So I just wanted to kind of make that like one little comment or those two comments. The one quick question that I did have is why do you guys reject allies?
Oh, why QM in particular?
Yes.
I wouldn't say we reject allies, but what I dislike is the framing of somebody being an ally. I wrote a piece about it at QM called "The Future of the Ally," and basically what I'm saying in it is, if you think of a person as an ally, then you're ignoring the fact that they too also benefit from sexual and romantic liberty. And I'm trying to move away from a kind of us versus them way of thinking about the issues. Straight people are not just our allies. they're our compatriots in the struggle for individual liberty, or in the case of people lucky like us, lucky enough to live in the West where we are free, the constant vigilance that it requires to maintain our liberty. So I don't dislike allies. I don't think that the word ally should never be used. It's certainly a useful metaphor when you're talking about a culture war. Might be more helpful to talk about allies if you were talking about, like, this would be way more productive. Let's reach across the aisle and find allies on the conservative side. That would be a really positive and healthy thing to do. But to call somebody a mere ally just because they happen to be born heterosexual is a little bit odd, in my opinion, because for all the reasons I said, straight people also like freedom.
And one last thing, Rio, do you see things shifting in the right direction, or do you have any kind of suggestions on things we can do to move them forward?
Yes. In some ways, the backlash is a good thing and will have a silver lining. It's giving us an opportunity as a society to reevaluate our priorities and to say, no, we're going to draw the line with this extremism. We're not going to accept this. So I think the way forward is to make a distinction between people who are of goodwill, who are, and this I think is the vast majority of people who are swept up in this backlash, I think are good people. Right. We need to make a distinction between those and between actual bigots who really just want to take advantage of this in order to try to turn back the clock on human rights in a way that would be truly regressive. If we can learn to distinguish between those two different groups of people, then we'll know that we can work on I started to say appeasing, but that's not the right word. I think a lot of the well-meaning people who are swept up in this backlash are doing it for good reasons, and we need to address them directly. We need to say, look, we're not going to do this thing that you're concerned about because that's genuinely bad. I don't believe in brainwashing children in critical pedagogy. I think that's a terrible idea. Let's not do that, right? So we can work with those people.
All right. He is Rio Veradonir, the editor-in-chief of Queer Majority. Rio, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it was great. I had a blast. You guys are a lot of fun. From you commies who let know you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.